Welcome to the show. We have Dr. Alex Fogleman back on again. We had him on a while back talking about the spirituality of the early church. So really grateful that he's coming on again to talk about his new book, Making Disciples. It's about catechesis and the revival of catechesis in the modern church. Alex has done a lot of work in this area. He's studied a lot about Augustine and his practices of catechesis, as well as the early church fathers and people from the great tradition of the church. And he's an assistant professor at Trinity Anglican Seminary, where I'm from, up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So it's great to make that connection there. But Alex, great to have you on again.
Thanks so much, Brian. Good to be with you.
So I really enjoy this book. And, to me, formation is in. Liturgy is in. That's like the new fad, right? Everybody wants rhythms and habits and all these types of things. And so your book, I think, is different in that it takes some of the high-level academic research that you're involved in and brings it down to more accessible levels. So it's very deeply rooted, but it's also available for just the average layperson to kind of peruse and gain some insight into some of these really helpful practices. But I'd love to hear your take on it, because you've been in this world. Why is liturgy and formation and all this stuff, why is it in now? Why is it the new fad, in your opinion?
Well, I hope it's not a fad. I hope it's something long-lasting with deep roots, and will have more endurance than many fads often do. But I grant that it is surprisingly popular. Surprisingly, there are many people that are interested and wanting to know this, to be deeply rooted. And I think that largely comes from a really just a need. I think it's more than just a passing interest. I think it's coming out of a place of need for many people in our culture who are feeling dislocated, who are feeling unrooted. And that owes to lots of things that are beyond the control of any one individual. I mean, it has to do with, automobiles and and urbanization. There's like larger forces that, we just find ourselves living in as people of this time and people of this place. But it is that sort of the allure. Part of it is the allure of thinking we can be people of just any place and any time and anywhere. So there's just some inherent things within our culture that are uprooting us, and fragmenting us, both in terms of place, in terms of where we are. I'm saying this as somebody who just moved from Texas to Pennsylvania, and I'm feeling the fragmentation. That literally, like that metaphor of being a plant who is taken out of the soil and then transplanted. To get even more granular, I was entrusted with the care of many of our houseplants in the move, and then some of them didn't make it. So I saw this, and then I had to apologize profusely to my wife. But so I think we feel that on a personal level. And then I think there's a larger cultural level in which we feel that fragmentation. So I think this pull towards formation of rootedness, of depth, is coming out of a need of saying we are not formed. And there seems to be something that we're tapping into that says, but we ought to be. There's an implied, and that's probably less often articulated, is that, yes, we feel fragmentation is disruptive. There's something negative it does to our souls and to our bodies and to our communities. And yet we're trying to not just recover something that was lost, but we are striving towards something that we know is right and good and whole about being human, that we feel drawn to. And we recognize that many things in our culture are driving us away from that goal.
That question of what it means to be a human, it sounds so lofty and abstract, but you can see it in a lot of ways. I was talking with a friend how it seems like today, and I didn't come up with this, but somebody else talked about it, where there's this hunger for a post-conversion theology. And you think about the movement of Christians going to therapy, or or, go work out, go outside. You need community. You need all these types of things. I think what they're angling at is it's not enough just to think your way out of these things. I think people feel frustrated, and I certainly have encountered that in my life, where you're like, okay, I've read the theology books, I've listened to the sermons, I'm not changing, and it's not because I don't feel guilty. It's not because I don't feel convicted. It's kind of like the force of the conviction isn't creating this joy and peace that I do think we're supposed to experience at least somewhat in this life. Obviously, we're not going to experience all of that. But then I think that's what's drawing people to say, okay, there's got to be a way to do this that transcends our time and place, that even though you can't be romanticized and say that they got it all perfect back then, there's still some ancient wisdom that can draw us in. And so the idea of catechesis to me is very interesting, because that's what your book primarily focuses on. And the title, Making Disciples, is very provocative to me in this way. Because when you go to Crossway, you go to Lifeway, whatever, you go to a Christian bookstore and you see Making Disciples, you're like, oh, this is teaching them how to memorize scripture, do an inductive Bible study, how to share the gospel, all these things. All good, all things you promote in your book.
Right. But I'm not against those.
You're not against those. But you go in a different angle, and you actually say that some of that, it's not bad, it's necessary, but it's not the full picture. So sketch out for us, what is catechesis, and what does it have to do with making disciples?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is, I would have several people, especially when I was early on working on this, say, like, what's different about this that's, churches aren't doing? Or like, what's different about this than, say, small groups or Bible study or Alpha or these men's ministry, women's, all the different kinds of things that we think about under the broad umbrella of discipleship. And I do grant that discipleship is a much larger category, a much larger umbrella. Under making disciples, and why catechesis, I'm sort of putting making disciples is the title and catechesis is the first word of the subtitle. Like, what I'm trying to do there is identify catechesis with this process of formation and the making of disciples. Or in other words, I'm trying to get at how this is about building foundations. And so I use a lot of this language about foundational faith, or this is about laying the grounds for discipleship. Like this is really at the sort of, I'm trying to get at the level of structure, at the level of roots, and at the level of foundations. So my sort of working definition of catechesis in the book is catechesis is a basic but comprehensive introduction into what Christians believe, hope, and love. And we can kind of talk more about that or unpack that further, because I intend each of those words very much to have lots of layers of meaning in them, but basic but comprehensive. So you can think of other forms of basic things that we encounter in the Christian life. The most obvious is the proclamation of the gospel, sharing the good news. That's basic to Christianity. That's like a thing that you start with, but it's not comprehensive. We wouldn't say that that's the entirety. You could say that the fullness of faith is found in the proclamation of the good news, and I'm fine to say that. But if you were to say, well, that's everything you need to know. Like, there's nothing more there. If you were to say that, then I would say that's probably not right. But it's not. So the other side of that is that it's not in-depth Bible study. It's not sort of high level. It's not preaching. Catechesis is right in between sort of what the proclamation of the gospel and pretty much anything that comes after that. I also make the case that it's still lifelong. Like, it's not something you never sort of graduate from or grow out of or think you've gotten beyond the need for foundational faith. But what I want to get at is that this is, we somehow have lost this sense of, when I'm being oriented to a new thing, whether it's a new activity, a new place here. I've just moved to Pittsburgh. Like someone will start, I need some kind of orientation to the place. I need a basic, but still comprehensive. I need someone to show me the map of Pittsburgh and say, this is over here, this is over here, this is over here. And that's not everything I need to know, but that helps me orient into this place in a new way, in a different way than if I'm just thrown in and said, yeah, you just go figure it out. We all know what we're doing here, and we're not going to help you.
Yeah.
And so I think broadly speaking, I think you can say something like we no longer live in a culture that is doing some of that orienting work. Like I do think there was a sense in which in Western culture, there was a time in which cultural sort of constructs and ways of thinking and inhabiting the world were doing some of the work of catechizing, so that what, say, somebody in the Reformation was doing when they're talking about catechism was needing to fulfill a very different function than what it's doing now. Basically, we've lost a lot of sort of cultural supports, sort of structures, and that to me is not necessarily a loss, because a lot of them those cultural supports weren't that good. They could be often sub-Christian at best. But there's a new time, and so I'm not a sort of a pessimist about this. I'm saying this is an opportune moment for the church to recover this practice, catechesis, that is an essential feature of the church's life. And what I want to say is that it just opens up lots of doors. It makes so many things possible for Christian life. When you have those foundations, you can really build a rich culture of discipleship in the local parish. Your preaching can do so much more when you have well-catechized people. You're able to do, so it's, a catechesis by itself is a good thing, I think, but it sort of affects what it does for preaching and discipleship and prayer and service to the community. My gosh, like a sort of having foundations for that stuff in catechesis, I just think it can really empower the local church to do all the things that it hopes to do and it wants to do. And so, yeah, I find it a hopeful kind of message.
Well, I appreciate that about your work, because again, you're not romanticizing the past, and you recognize, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, you mentioned automobiles and just, the internet, the world that we live in is drastically different. But those principles of catechesis, it's not that we just plop it into the modern day from the past, but we can retrieve it and formulate it in a way that we can adapt it to our modern times. And I think you have a lot of great practical ways, because it's like nothing's worse than you just read a book and you're like, this is great lofty stuff, and at the end you're like, I don't know what to do with it. But you have a great appendix, you have great snippets in between to say, and you even give examples, and we can get to them later, about how it's worked out in churches that you've been a part of, or people that you know who have implemented this, to show that this isn't meant to be something. I mean, it would be counterproductive for catechesis to be so lofty and impossible that you couldn't do it.
Right.
And so I think that the simplicity is really powerful. One thing that's really cool about your book too is you do a lot of tracing through history, some of these themes and ideas. You go to Augustine, you talk about Origen. No one's supposed to talk about Origen. So I was like, well, but you have these forays into history that are really helpful in giving us a context. What are some key insights about catechesis and formation in general that you encountered that were particularly stimulating for you, that you thought were really interesting, maybe even things that surprised you as you were studying these church fathers?
Yeah, I think I came into some of this research, and this has now been, and I say research, and I mean like just pretty much anything I've done over the last, I don't think of just this isn't just library work for me. This is a lot of been formed both in the library and mostly just working with churches, talking to pastors, talking with catechists. And I think when I probably started this a number of years ago, that it would just be like, oh, this is like recovering biblical literacy. It's like the people are ignorant. We must, alleviate their ignorance. This kind of that's pretty prideful.
Yeah.
It's
Everyone has a cage stage. You know what I mean?
yeah, that's right. So I would have probably thought that, catechesis is really important and necessary because we've just become dumb and we need to be smarter.
There's some truth to that. There's some truth to that.
Yeah. But I couldn't have written a book like it's the guy Nicholas Carr, the technology theorist, why the internet makes us dumber. The Shallows. The name of this book is The Shallows. Why the internet makes us dumber. I'm just not able to do that. But it's partially because what I found in sort of looking through this was that catechesis was much more than just sort of alleviating our theological illiteracy. It really was about building deep roots for encountering God. I've been, as a simple glance at the book will show you, I've been very influenced by the theologian Hans Boersma, who was a former teacher of mine, and who just is someone that I really trust and have learned a lot from. And part of what that sort of influence is brought upon me is really thinking about our telos, where are we going? Where is the church? What is our aim? What is the direction towards which we're going? And for many people, it's a more secular, this worldly kind of telos, whether of a non-Christian version or a Christian version of that. There's a way in which, as Christians in the modern world, we've been conscripted into a kind of secular framework. And so what I hoped that what I came out with, what I learned in this process, what surprised me, especially through reading some of the figures that you mentioned, that catechesis was about much more than just making people less dumb. It was about helping move people towards divine encounter, a true encounter with the living God. There's a recognition why this is theological. This isn't just sort of practical application stuff. And why this is theological is that if God is who the Bible presents God to be, then we need to be opened to that. We need to be formed. We need to be prepared. We need to become like God in order to know God as He is. So we see these images of sanctification, of holiness throughout the Scriptures, and they're moral. It's a moral holiness. It's an intellectual holiness. It's a spiritual holiness. It's just the holiness of the human being. And so what catechesis is doing is shaping and forming us as whole persons toward true encounter with God. And that's incredible. That's something to me, this is just a different kind of enterprise than, again, alleviating theological illiteracy. This was just some of the insights from that I got, and why so many sort of historical figures appear in this book is because I've seen some of my work as just listening to these people from the past and becoming friends with them. And then what I would like to do is just introduce people today to some of my friends. And that's kind of the way that I present some of this. So I don't tell you what Augustine says because you must believe something because Augustine thinks it.
Right.
I really I want you to introduce you to my friend.
Yeah.
This is pretty much how I go about it.
Well, you mentioned how, and I love how you put that, the whole person encountering God. And that's really what we want at the end of the day. You talk about our telos, the end for which we're made. And whether we're conscious of that or not, our lives are directed towards some kind of end. And the secular world has a vision for that. The Christian world has a vision for that. Different religions have visions for that. And just being aware of it. But it's not enough to just be aware. These practices actually shape us in a particular direction. And I always have to remind myself, all these church fathers you mentioned, they lived centuries apart. It wasn't like they, it's like they all knew each other. I mean, this is stuff that has lasted a really, really long time. And even though they're not uniform in everything that they think, there are some key through lines. And one thing you mentioned, and this is something that I've noticed reading some of the fathers and just, Augustine and Origen and all these guys, is that the modern separation between, theology and ethics and devotion is just foreign to them. And to the point where you read some of these guys, and you're like, are they legalists? Like, no, they're just, we're the weird ones. They're not thinking they're earning, maybe some of them did, but a lot of them, they're not thinking you're earning your salvation. They just view salvation as genuinely transformative, and they can't imagine your theology being detached from your piety. Yeah. And I think that is something that you kind of draw out. I was curious if you had any thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's another sort of, if there's a through line of the book, it is something like that. Not just, it's different than me, because I've always been gravitated towards theologians that advocate a kind of wholeness, a sort of recovery of, head, heart, and hands, or something like that. It's like, and so I've been attracted to that, but always kind of I always just kind of turned my head a little bit saying, is that right? Because that's something that before reading church fathers, that was something I was sort of drawn to, sort of spiritual formation movements, spiritual discipline, stuff like that. They're advocating for this kind of wholeness. Some of the stuff Jamie Smith has written about, things in that vein. I was like, that seems right. But then when I would read the fathers, I didn't see them making those same kind of claims. I just saw them doing theology. Like, I just saw them writing about the Christian life. And so it struck me at some point that they just haven't lived through the divisions of the fragmentation of knowledge that we currently live in. So that they do make categories. And this goes way back to sort of ancient philosophy. The difference between a rhetorician and a philosopher is the difference between one who just talks about stuff and one who actually lives in a different way. So there is that distinction, and that's older, beyond, that extends beyond sort of just Christian life. And that sort of integrity of human life, though, is something that they're getting at. But what I found so instructive about this sort of initiation into reading the fathers, not just as these are authorities that we must sort of stubbornly obey, but these are people who don't live with the same kind of fragmentations that we do. They may have other ones. They've got other issues, but they don't live with the same ones that we do. And so this sort of apprenticeship to them, and why I spend so much time talking about them in the book, is that by spending time with them, you start to unlearn some of the more unhelpful fragmentations. So it's not just like you don't go read Augustine and he's like, we think about the human person as head, heart, and hands, right? He just is writing about
go journal.
God. Go journal. So there's something that I was trying to get at. A book that I've just really loved is Andrew Louth's book called Discerning the Mystery, an essay on the nature of theology. It's just an awesome book. It's a slightly older book, and kind of hard to find, more expensive than it should be, et cetera. But it's one of these books that really helped me sort of shape the way I think about the sort of nature of knowing, and especially the nature of knowing God, which is just the task of theology, as this a participatory encounter with God, transforming union with God. Like all of those are entailed in simply the task of knowing God. So there's that was a really sort of influential book at a certain point, and shaped a lot of the sort of underlying, to use a $10 word, epistemology of this approach to catechesis. It comes from people like Louth. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the heart of what is this catechesis, or the components of it, because you map out under the rubric of faith, hope, and love 3 categories to help us understand practically, theologically, what catechesis is meant to do, what are the forms of it. So maybe just start from that. Starting from faith, hope, and love, how does that branch out into your vision, or not your vision, but the vision you see passed down of what catechesis is about?
Yeah, absolutely. That faith, hope, and love is something that sort of mapping faith, hope, and love onto central tenets of the Christian faith is something that goes way back. So when I say catechesis is a basic but comprehensive introduction to what Christians believe, hope, and love. It's faith, hope, and love. Faith sort of stands in for the creed, which I sort of map onto the doctrinal, intellectual life of the faith, what we think. Hope maps onto what it means to pray as a Christian. So it often maps onto the Lord's Prayer, how we relate to God, the spiritual life, the encounter with God. And then love usually maps onto something like the 10 Commandments, which is a way of helping Christians get oriented into how they ought to live, what it means to live the Christian life, to love one's neighbor, to love God and neighbor, but the living of the Christian life, how we relate to others, to the world. So faith, hope, and love become a kind of cipher for this. Again, inseparable. The point is that these are inseparable aspects of what it means to be a Christian. And my hope in that is a way of preventing us from reducing. Often catechesis will get reduced to kind of just intellectual, doctrinal formation. It's like you need to learn the creed, you need to know what it is to be a Christian, and then I don't know what to tell you after that. You should be good. So if there's one kind of tendency among sort of catechesis, catechism, instruction language, it tends to be a reductivity towards the intellectual. But what I do a good bit of work sort of trying to articulate the theological foundations of that faith, hope, and love as a sort of matrix of catechesis. Looking at even things like atonement theology and how this sort of like ways of understanding atonement theology as just as those are inseparable, and it's important to understand what God has done for us, how we relate to God, and how we relate to others. Those you can't separate any of those, just in the same way that you can't separate faith, hope, and love, just as you can't separate creed, prayer, and ethics. So something like that is what I'm getting at there.
You do make mention of catechesis, and I think you're right in that people who are really into catechesis, the gravitation might be more intellectual, which isn't bad, but it's a ditch you could fall into where, like you said, you just sit down, you read the catechism, maybe you read it out loud, you read the 10 Commandments, and you do a study on it, which is all good and part of the process. But you do mention in your book the relational aspect of catechesis, and that today you can just sit at a coffee shop and read it by yourself, whereas before you needed somebody else who you trusted, an authority figure, a pastor, a priest, whatever, who would sit down with you, or it would be a communal thing or something like that, where that relational aspect, where the medium is the message, where it's this personal transference of discipleship. And I mean, it's like the classic, oh my gosh, it's like the cringiest, the life on life. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's like, but there's a substance to that, where that embodied sort of
Yeah.
Catechesis is a critical part of it. I was thinking about, I was reading some of Luther's works, and he criticizes the medieval Catholic Church because they have all these sort of ornate, festivals and feasts and all the bells and whistles and all that stuff. And he's like, and we're just too simple. We just have the 10 Commandments and the Lord's Prayer, And, Luther, obviously, he's, that's his personality quirk. He can be abrasive in that way. But I think there's something to that where you look at it and you're like, oh, you're saying the 10 Commandments, pray the Lord's Prayer, and understand the Apostles' Creed, this basic outline of the faith. And it is very simple, but I think that there is something pedagogical about that, where it's supposed to be something that gets us, going in the Christian life and gets us maturing. So I thought that was a really helpful way that you've laid things out. I had a question about the stages of catechesis. So
yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, take us back in the time machine to Augustine's day or whomever.
Yeah.
What would that look like? And then maybe help us see what could that look like in a modern context?
Sure. Yeah. So I think there's two ways to think about the stages. One is when we're talking about the instruction of a new believer who's an adult or a teenager who's not growing up in a Christian home, something like that. That's what we learn, or what we see more in the early church, or that's the kind of more of the literature that's generated, is about the instruction and initiation and baptism of adults coming from a non-Christian background. I think there's a different way of talking about stages of faith when you're talking about children who grow up in a Christian home, and you're thinking about faith formation among there. I'll stick to just the first one for now, but in the book I deal with both of those. But what you see in the early church, and this is where a lot of this sort of like thinking about catechesis comes from throughout Christian history, is based on what emerges in the first sort of 4 or 5 centuries of the church's life. And this is when you see if there's usually a series of kind of 4 stages. They don't call them stages. Like, that's again, modern sort of like, we need clear boundaries. We need clear categories for things. And I should also say this is like synthesizing different things that are happening around the ancient world. So I like to think of it, these are people who are building the plane as it's flying, and then writing about it, or other people are writing about it. And they're mostly writing about it for other churches to use. So they're trying to bring, in the writing down of these things, you guys have to ask, like, why in the ancient world is anybody writing anything at all? Like, it's not like, they can just get on the internet and just write whatever they want because they want to express themselves, like they write things very purposefully. And I think it's that way with writing about catechesis as well. But what you see in terms of kind of stages is somebody who is just wanting to be first acclimated to the church. Maybe their neighbor has talked to them about the faith, or somebody they live near or work alongside of. Evangelism often is happening in very sort of just normal, everyday ways. Like to say, there's not a Billy Graham crusade that's happening out there. So there's not a ton of like writing about evangelism. There is, of course, it's not absent, but you don't hear as much about that as you hear about descriptions of these formation processes. So you have somebody that wants to become a Christian, and they say, well, that's great. We're going to invite you to be a catechumen for a period of time. And that can be from several months to several years. And so but when you first join the catechumenate, as we call it now, to join that rank, to join the rank of catechumens, and catechumens just means hearers. It's a term that it's often it appears a handful of times in the New Testament. This catechesis language is just a Greek word. It often means teaching. But that became, by the 2nd century, that became like an official role in the church. So someone could be a catechumen, and it meant they're a part of the church, but they're not baptized. So they'd be a catechumen for a number of years, and their job is really just to be a hearer. They're not like, signing up for the altar guild, or like, signing up to volunteer to, do something at the church. They're like, your job is a hearer for now, and it's allowing you to sort of be acclimated to the Christian way of life. You're going to learn things in there, like you're going to be taught things during that time, and you teach things like the Christian story, like what is the overarching story of Scripture, and they would teach the basics, what the rule of faith, or kind of early versions of the creed, to provide these again basic categories. What is the story of Scripture? Who is the God who we know in Jesus Christ? Like it's those kinds of things that one learns during this period. But they're also, as you mentioned, and what I talk about in the book, is that there's partly just a relational dimension. You're learning how to be a Christian by living among Christians. And you're doing that as you're just getting started into the faith, like you're being a part of it. So you be a catechumen for a number of years, you're learning the faith, you're living the Christian life, and there's kinds of, and people are watching, it's like you would have somebody like a sponsor come along, like what we now know as godparents, but they would call a sponsor, would come alongside you and just walk with you through this period of life. And they're also like giving an account of your life. So when you join the catechumenate, people would ask you, like, who are you? What's your family life? How many wives do you have?
Very important information.
And they would ask about your occupation. And there are many occupations that early Christians just thought, you know what? You can't do that job and be a Christian, because that's tied into some form of idolatry, which many jobs were, like including like school teachers. Like it would be, they would. So it's sort of like you have to sort of participate in this examination of life. So you go through this process of catechesis, and then usually several months before baptism. So typically people were baptized around Easter in the springtime, and usually in early, say, January, in a number of places, this becomes kind of custom. You'd submit your name, say, okay, I've been a catechumen for however long. I'm ready to be baptized. I want to be baptized. And so then there's a sort of a stage in between catechesis and baptism that's sometimes calls sometimes they're called new names, like Augustine calls them the competentes, the co-petitioners, those who are seeking together. Cyril of Jerusalem calls them the enlightened ones. I mean, or really it would be translated as something like those who are being enlightened. He sees people would often talk about baptism as illumination, like divine illumination. You're receiving the Holy Spirit in baptism. So catechesis is preparing for this. So this is basically what we know now as Lent. Like the season of Lent really originated around catechetical formation before Easter. And so that's when you're entrusted. There's this process of entrustment with the creed. It's called the traditio symboli, the tradition of the symbol, literally the handing over of the symbol or the creed. So they're entrusting you with the creed, and a bishop will explain it to you. And your task is to give it back, to return it, a reditio, a traditio, and a reditio. So you're being given the creed, and then you learn it, you memorize it, you inscribe it into your soul, and you profess it back to the bishop at baptism. You also learn the Lord's Prayer in the same way. It's a handing over. You're entrusted with this. These aren't just like things to learn. These are sacred deposits of the church. And so it's this really sort of really rich sort of spiritual process. And so there's fasting and illumination and fasting and preparation for this. And then you're baptized at Easter, and that's its own sort of significant event. And then the period after baptism is called mystagogy, meaning a leading into the mysteries. And that's when you're explaining the sacraments, you're explaining what baptism and the Eucharist are, the different parts about worship. So they're understanding this whole process from pre-catechesis to catechesis to this like illumination stage to mystagogy. They're seeing the process of becoming Christian as a process, as a way into this form of life. And so they're saying you don't just learn everything haphazardly. You learn it all at once. It's a recognition of starting here and ending here. It's not really an end, but this is the point you're going, and thinking about how does one get there? How does one move along the way? So that's the kind of stages of it.
How do you apply? I mean, when you think about the 10 Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, you're saying avoiding just the intellectualism. So they have to memorize it, they have to recite it, they're having them fast. How would they use the 10 Commandments in the Lord's Prayer? Would they have them? Like what kind of practice were associated with that, in addition to them learning the content of what they teach?
Yeah. So 10 Commandments comes a little bit later. When Augustine does this, he does the faith, hope, and love thing. Instead of the 10 Commandments, he does the twin commandments of love God and neighbor. And so he sort of explicates them that way. 10 Commandments comes as a medieval development, and it comes as like actually a guide to confession. It's like when you're preparing for confession, you go through the 10 Commandments and stuff. And then the Reformers really include the 10 Commandments as the basic template for the ethical life of the Christian in the Reformation. But how they use, so they learn it, they memorize it. But the Creed and the Lord's Prayer are quite early. And there's even some evidence of things like Psalm 23. There's a few cases in which Psalm 23, there are other texts you see them talking about these texts in the same way. Psalm 23 is one of the more interesting ones to me, that they're handing over in the same sort of handing over kind of way. But they'll talk about these things not only as like things to believe, but they talk about these as this is your armor for the Christian life. You inscribe this, you keep this rule of life, rule of faith at hand, and you keep it with you every day, so that it becomes a way that you see the world, so that it shapes your everyday thoughts and your actions and your attitudes. So they see these things like the Creed and the Lord's Prayer as these entrustments, that these are symbols and tokens of the church, but they also see them as like almost like we would call spiritual practices or spiritual exercises that you live with and you keep with you throughout your day as you go about whatever it is.
So you talk a little bit about the process, not just of catechesis, but of knowing itself. And there's an interesting section where you talk about something like going from darkness to the cloud, to, the successive modes of knowing God. I'm curious about that. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, that particularly comes from Gregory of Nyssa.
Yeah.
And he writes about this in a couple of different places. And this is, but the most accessible one is his book, The Life of Moses. He does this, and writes about the Song of Songs and stuff, but he writes about this process of growing, what we would call growing in the Christian life, as a process of, and he traces a lot of this to like the biblical sort of typologies, but he sees Moses as somebody who first he encounters the burning bush in Exodus 3, but that's from darkness to light. It's a burning bush. There's illumination there, and for many of us, like that's kind of where we stop. We're like, great, right. Illumination. I see the light now. But he talks about this moving into into what he calls the cloud, and he's looking at Moses going up into the cloud, ascending the mount, entering into the cloud, and then even a kind of divine darkness. So this is the basis for a lot of later what we call mystical theology, and it's a recognition for Gregory. It's very clearly premised on an understanding of who God is. God is infinite goodness, love, peace, joy. God is an infinitude of these things. And if that's the case, then what it means to grow into the Christian life, if growing in the Christian life is becoming like God, then one sort of never sort of reaches that goal, so to speak. The more that they become like God, the more that they love God, Gregory will say, the more their love for God grows. Or the more that they desire God, the more that their capacity for knowing and loving God grows. So that's just is his vision of the Christian life. And so I talk a little bit about that. Is this, again, there's different, I think when we have different paradigms for what it means to come to know God that are based on these sort of rich theological paradigms, then I think that then changes the way we think about the practice, if that makes sense. Yeah.
That's really helpful. And that's an interesting paradox. I don't know if it's a paradox, but it's the more that you desire God, the more the gap sort of widens, the deeper you go in. The recognition of his infinite nature expands even more. Which is crazy to think about.
Yeah, he draws on this from the language of St. Paul. This language of stretching out. I don't say that I've already claimed to know things, but I stretch out, reaching out towards the mark. So he picks up on that language, and that's sort of becomes a way that he thinks about the Christian life.
Well, help us figure out how to do this today. I mean, I'm just thinking most people are, well, maybe this is dwindling a little bit, but a lot of people come to the church and are like, well, I've already been baptized. I'm already a Christian. And to say, well, we want to put you through catechesis is like saying we want to put you back in first grade.
Yeah.
And it's not as much of an expectation even. I mean, you think about churches more of less of a center of communal life and more of just, a consumable good kind of thing. So with all the things that are swirling around our modern day, what are some ways that you've seen this work?
Yeah, I think it can work in a lot of different ways. And again, I try to spell some of those out in the book, more giving examples. I don't do a lot of very programmatic, this is what you should do if you want to do catechesis the right way.
Right.
I try to give examples, and that's the way I see both historical models and contemporary models. I see these as ways of shaping our imagination so that we can take what we've learned from history, from theology, from the present. So what I try to do is gather these examples in the book with the hopes that people will read it and then they'll be inspired to bring some of these practices into their own churches. But that is I think one thing that people will run into is like, are you just like paternalizing people, telling them that they've got to go back to Sunday school, like go back to like children's, Sunday school? And it's like, no, I think there's so many ways one could bring the foundational faith instruction into the life of the church. I was at church in Texas, in Waco, where I sort of tested a lot of this stuff and learned a lot of this stuff from the wonderful priests there. Was we would do catechesis for a year, or school year, basically time frame, and we'd go through the catechism every year. But it was for anybody that was coming to church. Like, if you want to be a part of this parish, this is what everybody does. Like, this is just kind of what we do here. So when I moved there, I had a master's degree in theology, and I went through a year of catechesis. In the same time, so was a recently retired theology professor from Baylor University, right? So it was like, doesn't matter who you are, this is the front door. And that actually sets a really unique sort of theological culture within the church. Like we all share this faith. Our bond isn't this, that, or the other. What unites us is the faith that was once delivered. So that's really powerful. So I think there's ways where you can build this into a church's culture that is, just part of the normal life of the church. Like we go to worship, we say so many, at least in my Anglican church, we say the same things all the time. And yet we don't sort of get tired of these things because they're good. Like we learn the more that we say the creed, the more that we say these beautiful prayers, the more that we hear the word of God. Same with the catechism and the sort of basics of the Christian faith. Like the more I don't fully understand the Lord's Prayer. Do you? Like that's what I would ask people. It's like you're done with this.
You've exhausted the.
I've got everything I need from this. It's like no. What we want is for folks to enter more deeply into the Lord's Prayer. And again, if you have that kind of Gregory of Nyssa, like ever deepening desire for God, like every time you read the Lord's Prayer, that's what it could be. It's not that it has to be. And I'm not saying like, oh, if you find this boring, like you're a bad Christian or something like that. It's like, but I just want to unpack that the spiritual riches are there in the creed and the catechism, prayer commandments. Like the spiritual riches are there. And I think one of the job of a catechist is to open up those treasures for the church today, to see them with fresh eyes and to see that how much more is there that God has for us in these tenets.
That unifying factor, I think, is a good point. Just reciting the creed together, the Ten Commandments. I mean, that is the kind of stuff that binds people together, and it reminds you of your corporate identity in I think powerful ways that are embodied. When you guys did the catechesis, was it like a class, a Sunday school, if you will, that you went through each week, or was it something more informal?
We would do like formal, like we do usually for an hour or so, and before worship, so that this is just like when church started. And we would do catechesis. Yeah, for usually for an hour or so. Another key part of the formal process of catechesis is that we leave a lot of time for questions, for seeking, for people. This is a time that many people. This is the only time that they can ask these questions. These are the burning questions that people have. They can't just like raise their hand in the middle of the liturgy and say, well, what about free will and God's providence or something like that.
Yeah.
So this is the space where I realized it was much more about the dialogue between catechist and catechumen during this phase, and not just it moves things from just these are thoughts that I have to like these are becoming deeply set. Like this is a part of my own understanding, not just like this isn't just borrowed faith that somebody's explained to me, but I don't really understand. This is the part where, again, it's that traditio and reditio. Like that's the sort of key move that I think that happens in catechesis. That's again kind of marks it out as a unique sort of practice within the church's life.
Well, this has been a really great conversation, and we're going to have links to Alex's book in the show notes. I encourage you to get a copy of this, read it for yourself, and share it with people in your church, because I think it really is it's a helpful and accessible guide. And it'll also open up a lot of windows to some other guys you could read, some of Alex's friends from who are long dead, but there's his friends nonetheless. And
they're alive and well.
Yeah, right. That's right. They are. That's right. Reigning in glory. And but yeah, I think this is going to be a great resource. And thanks a lot for coming on, Alex. It's been a great time.
Thanks so much, Brian. It's so good to be with you again, and look forward to more discussions soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening to this episode. If you liked it, please support the show and consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You can find all the links to our YouTube channel and our Instagram account in the show notes. Thank you guys for joining us.